everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Love, Sex and Data conference. Have you been having fun? Because right now we're about to have an incredible conversation with 3 pleasure activists about why having fun, pleasure and leisure is such an important part of social change and why it is a lot more political and important than we give it credit to be. I'm Debasmita from Agents of Ishq and I'm your MC for this session. A few things to go over before we begin the session. Indian Sign Language is available, translations are available in Indian Sign Language, as you can see on the screen. The session will also have audio translations in Hindi and Marathi today, which you will be able to access by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. If you click on it, the languages will pop up and you can get your translations. जिन लोगों को हिंदी में ऑडियो ट्रांसलेशन चाहिए, आपके स्क्रीन के नीचे एक गोला सा ग्लोब आइकन है, आप उस पर क्लिक कीजिए और आपको हिंदी में ट्रांसलेशन मिल जाएगा. We request you to be respectful and respectful to the speakers and their opinions. We want this to be a safe space and open space where people can have discussions. There will be a Q&A session at the end, towards the end of the session. The moderator will take questions and you can put your questions in the Q&A box. So whatever questions you have in your heart, definitely tell us in the Q&A box at the bottom. So as you know, at LSD, so today our panel is called Pleasure as Passion, Pleasure as Ration, initiatives that have deployed pleasure politics. As you know, at LSD and in the work that Agents of Ishq and the YP Foundation do, we have been very, very passionate about pleasure. We love pleasure with all our hearts. And it's not just because it's something that makes us feel good, but although that also is a good enough reason, but also because it has played such an important part. It can play such a transformative role in work that aims to have some kind of social change. And we're not alone in these beliefs and in this work. And as this panel will prove, because today we have 3 amazing people who have really addressed this politics of pleasure in this work. Some of the questions that we will be thinking about today that we will deep dive in with the panelists' expertise and their experiences are, how can taking pleasure seriously make conversations on safe sex much more effective? And who do we consider to be deserving of pleasure? And what are the kind of hierarchies that we create when we say things like, when we make assumptions like being marginalized means that you have no time for pleasure? These are some of the conversations that we will be having today. Today, our first panelist is Judy Amina. She's an advocacy officer. She's an advocacy officer who believes very strongly in the sexual and reproductive health and rights of young people in Kenya. And right now she's advocating to include comprehensive sexuality education in the Kenyan school curriculum. And we are so very excited to have to know about the role that pleasure plays in the advocacy work that she does. Our second speaker is the amazing Philpott. She is the founder of the Pleasure Project, which she founded in 2004. She is a public health professional. She calls herself a pleasure propagandist. We absolutely love that word. And she's a guerrilla girl of HIV prevention. The Pleasure Project has been so instrumental in putting forward this discourse on why we need to talk about pleasure when it comes to conversations about safe sex. It recently received the WAS Award, which is a World Association of Sexual Health Award, just a few days back. So congratulations, Anne. And of course, our third panelist is Surabhi Yadav, who is a gender and rural development practitioner. And we really love Surabhi. She runs Sanjay Sapne, which is a non-profit, which aims to give skills to women in villages, young women in villages, and guarantees them contemporary jobs. And she is also popularly known as the founder of the amazingly beautiful and very much well-loved photo project, Women at Leisure, which talks about time and leisure as a feminist issue. And so she herself puts this very beautifully, that she wants to see a world where women-led development is more common than women development, and where women living in villages are recognized for their potential rather than for their pain. And of course, to bring together this entire panel, we have Nisha Susan, our moderator. Those who know Nisha, she is a brilliant writer, like very witty, and like her writing always gives everyone pleasure who reads it. She's a journalist. She was a co-founder of the Ladies Finger and has recently written a book last year called The Woman Who Forgot to Invent Facebook and Other Stories. She's also one of the people who has helped us curate like this panel and this entire conference. So over to Nisha, our moderator, to start this exciting conversation with these exciting pleasure activists, pleasure propagandists, if me, let's say.
Oh, thank you, Debsmita, for the most loving introductions. I mean, I just feel like full blanket has been put around me. I was joking earlier to Paramita that this is the one panel that doesn't need a moderator, because all the ladies on this panel can just like be stars without any moderation or intervention included. But I just wanted to set up the panel in case this is the first session of the conference that you're attending, or you haven't had a chance to fully have a focused engagement with the conference. At a very basic level, here goes. Okay, so about a month or two ago, I came across this paper called "Are Cigarette Smokers Happier?" And I found it very, very funny. The title of the paper, and I also found it funny that it was produced in MIT, and these two economists engaging very seriously with this question. Engaging very seriously with this question about smoking, because what they were addressing is this: in all the things that US health policy and taxation has done to make sure that people smoke less, the one thing apparently that they haven't figured out is that people smoke because it's so nice to smoke. Now, as a non-smoker, I do watch people, and I do understand that feeling of having this thing between your fingers like this, and the face that you make, and this head movement and all of this thing. I mean, as a complete non-smoker who runs away from cigarettes, I can still get it. So apparently it took, I don't know, 30 years of health economics work for someone to get around to writing this paper, which said, perhaps we've got the wrong end of the cigarette stick, right? Perhaps we're not figuring it out because we forget that it's fun to smoke, right? So, I mean, that's the state of the world in some sense, right? So given that that's the state of the world, I want to introduce you to like one of the rock star panelists today, Anne Philpott, who has 100% always got the right end of the stick as far as this pleasure business is going. Okay, so let's go to Anne, and she will tell us how she's been a pleasure propagandist from the time that she was in a diaper.
That's high praise indeed from the pink chuddy person.
True. That was my diaper.
Thank you so much. Definitely the world has got the wrong end of the stick when it comes to sexual health and sex education, and exactly what you're saying in that the pleasure has been erased from also something that actually benefits you and can feel good. So I'm going to talk a bit about our journey as the Pleasure Project and tell you also about some of the fun campaigns we've done to try and kind of put a pinprick in the HIV and sex education world. So if you could go to the first slide, that would be great. But first of all, just to say, it's so exciting to be here. I've been kind of the lunatic at the AIDS conferences, waving a pleasure flag, saying, where's the pleasure, people? And to be at a conference that's completely focused on pleasure, it's, which is the key motivating factor for sex, is just amazing. And it's like a big support group for me. So thank you so much. I'm going to talk just about our journey in terms of how we've tried to get more pleasure into this world of sexual health. And I just was thinking about this morning and thinking, in 10 years' time, maybe earlier, hopefully, people will look back and think, how weird that there wasn't pleasure in sex education. Like, how odd is that, right? When it's arguably the key motivating factor for sex. So I'm just, I think all on this panel are going to be highlighting this, obvious but inconvenient truth. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this and thank you for this conference. So I'm going to talk about the fact that we also need to build much stronger bridges between the world of public health, sexually explicit media, HIV prevention, also feminism in global health and pleasure. And I think we shouldn't be defeated by these global narratives that actually manage to take the pleasure out of sex. So I was inspired to start the Pleasure Project when I was attending AIDS conferences, and I was being really, my first AIDS conferences, I was concentrating really hard. I was trying to understand all the sessions. But then I thought, if a Martian landed at these conferences, they would think that AIDS is an airborne disease, because nobody was actually talking about sex in any form. And the thing that finally blew my mind was I went to a session about vaginal microbicides, which are gels that you put inside the vagina that can prevent HIV. I'm watching the interpreter to try and understand how they have to interpret that. I'll go slowly. And in that session, basically it's a lube, right, that can prevent HIV, which is fantastic. The session I went to, there was no mention of the vagina or the penis entering the vagina or pleasure. And it just blew my mind that this obvious advantage to a lube that can prevent HIV was just missed completely. I mean, I just thought, really, this has all gone wrong. And on the next slide is just an example of some of the ways that it's gone wrong. Here's some very depressing pictures of the way that HIV prevention has been handled. One from the UK, don't die of ignorance, whatever that means. And then another one from Zimbabwe, I think. Just the shaming way that sex education and HIV prevention has tried to actually, you know, we know it's entirely ineffective to use shame and fear to motivate behavior change. And so another moment of inspiration for me was when I was working in Sri Lanka with sex workers and promoting, and we were talking about how to promote the internal condom, the female condom. And I learned so much about how to eroticize condom use in those workshops about, and I can show you later if you like, how to actually promote the internal condom, the female condom as a sex toy, how to talk about the rubbing of the outer ring on the clitoris and how good that felt. And I just thought this is in such sharp contrast to what the supposed experts are doing in the world of sex education. And actually the expertise of sex workers or of people who regularly negotiate safer sex should be so much more honoured. And they're the experts which are so often marginalised in these kind of traditional worlds of data and expertise. So that was another moment of inspiration for me, was actually remembering that safer sex can feel good, that putting on a condom can be like squeezing into your favourite sexy boots or a latex dress ready for action. Like pretty much everything we know of is sold on sex, like toothpaste, cars, the lot. And yet safer sex isn't sold on sex. It's just such a obvious gap. And I think that's, and I can say this because I'm a public health person, but I think that's because the wrong people have been put in charge of this. And they're people who come from a biomedical background who focus on disease and risk. You know, for example, why not promote, you know, sexy masturbation tips? And I know agents of Ishq are all over this as a way of really promoting safer sex. And lastly, you know, there's strong evidence that the pursuit of pleasure is a primary reason to have sex and also can make sex education much more effective. So just on the next slide, I'll be super quick, but these are just some of the disadvantages of taking a negative approach to sex education. And there's some pictures up there that you might recognize, and some young women looking very alarmed by the sex education lesson they're having there on the right. Just, you know, it's wrong on many levels and also reinforces pleasure privilege. So certain groups are often in sex education, and it's very gendered, will have their pleasures talked about. Like often in sex education, if young men get it, they will be told about wet dreams, or they'll be told about masturbation, maybe from a negative perspective. But young women or vulva owners will be told about periods. That'll be it, periods, and then don't get pregnant, you know. So there's a lot of ways that also a negative narrative that doesn't talk about the potentials of pleasure just doesn't work, and not just in a health perspective but on a gender equity perspective as well. So we want, in the Pleasure Project, we want visions of pleasure rather than disease reduction. We want to be tracking outcomes in programs that aim for 1 billion sexy safe sex acts rather than tracking the current 1 billion STIs that are in the world. And we want people and programs to be funding, to be focusing on pleasure-based sexual health. So now I'm just going to quickly go through some of the campaigns that we've used. And on the next slide, you'll see some of the work that we've done at AIDS conferences to really hold the mirror up to people who actually have power in this world, who have funding in this world. of what sex education can look like, and really provoke the public health and sex education world. So we've been showing up to AIDS conferences for 16 years with our posters, with our postcards, sticking them up in the bathrooms and just having fun, really. This was one of the postcards we put out, and it's a list of why do people really have sex. And it's inspired by the ecosexual Annie Sprinkle that some of you might know. It's a bit of fun to say, you know, people have sex for pleasure, but for many other reasons. Many of these reasons never get a look in at AIDS conferences, where it's all focused on STIs and disease. The next slide shows another campaign that we did, which I think could be, when do people get asked this question in sex education? You know, when do they get to reflect on what they enjoy or what they want to aim for? When do we, what I say is, how do we know how to say no if we're never taught how to say yes? Like, how can we choose what we want if we're never asked these questions? So we put this up at a AIDS conference and then collected people's experiences, which was very illuminating. The next slide just shows some rather, because it's love, sex and data, the next slide shows some rather depressing data about the AIDS conference last year and how many sessions actually focused on pleasure. And I'm thinking if we did this analysis for this conference, it would be 100% of the sessions focused on pleasure. So I might do that afterwards as a best practice example of where the AIDS conferences could go. The next slide just shows another postcard we put out, which was really to provoke people to think about, the fact that young people don't only learn about sex in sex education if they're lucky, but actually they learn about it from a whole range of sources, and sexually explicit media and porn becoming a primary one. And we know that maybe 5 to 10% of internet downloads are sexually explicit or pornographic. That's something that the sex education world rarely discusses. And Judy's going to be talking about her amazing work in Kenya in terms of actually being able to be sex positive in sex education. So I'm just going to I am quickly going through, so I'll just quickly show you some of the posters. The next slide shows you a very fun campaign we did at an AIDS conference. So we just put this poster up at the beginning of the AIDS conference because, masturbation is one of the best safer sex techniques there is. And put this up around, people were like, oh, shocked, running up to us in the corridors and worried about this. And I'd never seen a study or a presentation at an AIDS conference about the importance of wanking or masturbation. Like, this was just also blowing my mind. And so we put this up, and then the next day, on the next slide, we put this poster up. So we've, followed the way that data's presented at AIDS conferences. And we said, oh, we've collected the data from this conference to work out how many of you did masturbate last night. And this really provoked the crowds, because this was a way of getting people to also think of themselves as sexual beings and how maybe that was affecting their practice as HIV prevention people. Of course, many of the kind of epidemiologists and scientists ran up to us and said, how did you know? How did you get that figure? And then we came up with these brilliant, we did, like, there was a counterfactual, and we worked with all the different venues and la, 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 la. So then there were some rather worried looking people leaving our session. And then we really got going at that AIDS conference. And the next poster was one where we were also trying to, so on the next slide, we're just trying to also bring up the subject of themselves as sexual beings and also access to information, and put this up. And that, it's just showing how you can use fun campaigns to really bring up the politics of where people, not just young people, where people get information, and why it's important to address that in terms of HIV prevention. On the next slide, we've had some exciting news recently, in that the World Association of Sexual Health has ratified their sexual pleasure declaration. That happened 3 weeks ago. We've been working really hard with WASP to get this sexual pleasure declaration out. It follows their declaration on sexual rights, because pleasure-based sexual health always is rights-based, and it's really helpful for all of us in this space to know that a global normative agency has issued a call to action and also evidence papers about why sexual pleasure is important for sexual health. And so do go to the WASP website and look that up, and that should really help you in terms of justifying the credibility of your work. We're also working with the World Health Organization to do a systematic review of the evidence, because there hasn't really been enough research about pleasure inclusive sexual health and why that's important to reach sexual health outcomes. And there's going to be a big series of papers around the pleasure declaration. So we are moving forward. And then just on the last slide, this is our new 7 pleasure principles for pleasure-based sexual health. Oh, I hope it's going to activate. It's a funky GIF that goes, but maybe it's not going to work, sadly. And basically, it's a all you can see is the empty slide. Sorry, is a GIF that works. I can put that in.
Don't worry about it, Anne. We'll come back to it also, so you can talk about it
Sure,
now,
okay.
and I'd like to discuss it later on in the conversation as well. So yeah.
Sure, okay, so we can do that. It's basically action steps to put into place the pleasure declaration. So how you basically activate pleasure-based sexual health in aspirational, fun, inspirational ways. And just a couple of them that maybe people would be interested in. At the core of the pleasure principles is the importance of being positive. Think about how sex can be good for you, how good sex, good safe sex that's rights-based can be good for your mental health, can be good for your physical health. Flipping the narratives from ones of death, danger and disease to ones of passion, pleasure and joy are really, really central to this. And I think also that another one that we have in the pleasure principles is to love yourself. So to build a pleasure inclusive world, we need to love ourselves, be kind to each other. And, you know, obviously there's a play on words there in terms of playing with yourself, being safe, good sex. But we also mean, you know, that the journey to pleasure-based sexual health can be one that's fun. You can have joy along the way. It doesn't have to be something that's one of those usual international development kind of advocacy campaigns, but also that pleasure stigma can be tough to deal with. So it's good to also take stock, talk to other people who are pleasure activists, understand your own journey and how that might affect your work. Think about your own boundaries and what you're willing to talk about. And then just reflect in terms of becoming a pleasure-based activist. So that's it from me. Just to lastly say, go to our website and have a look at the pleasure principles that are up there. We've got a consultation on them and we'd love your views on them. Thank you.
That was great, Anne. I mean, it's really setting up the conversation for us. So if you've ever been to kind of wellness conference or like a health conference, and you went to the stall where they're selling this amazing moisturizer, that's this panel. Okay, this is the panel which will show you the before and after effects of pleasure. Like just put it on and your skin will get so much better. Okay. So, I mean, to go to a live demonstration of this moisturizer, Judy is going to tell us, I hope, about this really cool research that she did in Kenya, and the research also extended to Ghana, about comprehensive sexuality education in schools and out of school, with out of school learners as well, and what the pleasure positive aspects played out as and how it worked out. If I'm going to share a link in a bit of Judy's paper, you should check it out. It's really interesting to read. And if you're from India, it will sound super familiar also.
Thank you so much, Nisha. I think Anne was able to capture so many of the things that are also part of what we found out in Kenya in the research, and also what I generally do right now. So maybe I'll just start with a brief background of what I do and how exactly comprehensive sexuality education looks like in the Kenyan context. So I'm currently working as an advocacy officer at the Center for the Study of Adolescence. And truly, as the name Center for the Study of Adolescence, we really focus on advocacy and work around attainment of sexual and reproductive health for adolescents and young people. Also, the fact that we are focusing on adolescents and young people, we are in an environment where reproductive health for adolescents and young people do not look like it's a thing that should be happening. It seems like adolescents and young people do not have any feelings. Adolescents and young people should not know anything about their reproductive health. And adolescents and young people should not have any pleasure. Even though the sexual debut in our country currently is at about 13 years for boys, 13 years for girls, and 15 years for boys. And that is actually data that is about 2 years ago. Currently, I'm sure it's even the age of the sexual debut still way lower. So with that, we know that the main motivation for sex, especially for young people, and even for everyone else, is pleasure. Yet, we do not have any kind of curriculum that is pleasure-based. So in 2018, we had a research that was supported by a program called Get Up Speak Out. It was really focusing on young people and empowering them. And in this project, we spoke to peer educators, we spoke to learners who are getting comprehensive sexuality education. We spoke to young people who are out of school, who are also accessing comprehensive sexuality education. And we spoke to teachers who are giving this kind of information. Of course, there are a few people who are very positive about pleasure and sexuality. However, that's those who are accountable people. I think maybe two or three. But then there were so many people who are fixing pleasure and sexuality education with religious views, fixing pleasure and sexuality education with cultural views. And when we look at that, sometimes it doesn't really match because the kind of religious views and cultural views that we've been conditioned to believe around pleasure are not really for enjoying this pleasure, and then they are also alienating to different groups of people. They are alienating to women, especially alienating to people who are living with HIV, alienating to young people and adolescents, and also alienating to people who are living with disabilities. And therefore, these kind of discussions do sometimes cause sometimes even injustices because not having to be able to have to enjoy pleasure and enjoy safe sex, I think is an injustice. That's something that should not be. Everyone should be able to enjoy sex and enjoy pleasure. So from that research and what we were able to find out, I moved to a different organization, however, still in the same area. But we are also looking at how we'll be able to provide comprehensive sexuality education in a way that is more and easily understood to young people, but also not leaving the part of pleasure out of sexuality education. So there are two challenges apart from what we already have. One, the Kenyan government does not allow for comprehensive sexuality education to be in the school curriculum. Why? Because we are told some aspects of reproductive health are already in the Kenyan school curriculum, and that is just simple things about menstruation and maybe a little about the reproductive health system of a girl and reproductive system of a boy. So many other things around contraception, so many other things about privacy, about consent, about enjoying it is not part of the curriculum, and no one wants to hear about it. So that's one. Two, the curriculums that are available in the country, even the ones by civil society organizations, they are not pleasure based. They are very typical of what we already know. They are very old fashioned also because they are very textbook oriented and they do not cater to the needs of young people and adolescents. So what are we doing? We've decided to try and step out of that. Currently, together with our team, we are doing something we are calling alternative forms of comprehensive sexuality education, and it's through games. And these games have different kind of messages. So we have an online game like Solitaire, which is a card game. We are still finalizing on it. I'll be able to share. And it has messages on different forms of sexuality education. Some what is already known and what is easily accessible, like the Kenyan concept, but also some that are stepping out of the box. Something that is more exciting, something that is more engaging. We are turning the textbook context of sexuality education from only having it in school, from just a particular teacher, but now bringing it to online platforms. We all know during the COVID period, so many people are now in tune with the social media platforms and different platforms online, apart from face-to-face discussion. We took advantage of that and learned from that. So we are having digital, more videos about different topics, teenage pregnancies, but about teenage pregnancy, what else? Sex, what exactly is sex? What does it mean for a young person? what does content mean, what does other things mean, and what is pleasure. And because so many things cannot be part of those, or so many things cannot be part of those videos, we also found a better way of doing it. So while we're disseminating, we ensure that we have a group of young people who have understood it, who have seen the gaps, and who know how well they can actually share this information to their peers. So we have things like movie nights, where the different young people would actually disseminate the content and talk about it freely without being without fear, freely without not trying to hide some aspects that they not usually talk about. So here they will tackle issues about pleasure. Here they will get questions about from other young people about the different issues that the topics that they are talking about, and would actually be able to tackle them. And we get so many different questions around sex, uh, things that you not actually think that up to now you'd be able to hear those questions. So it should be like, what does sex actually feel like? Things that we do not speak about when it comes to the full context. Things we do not talk about when it comes to even the family setup, when it comes to speaking with adolescents and young people. It might seem very simple, but these kind of things really help to even shape the decisions and help in the decision making of the adolescents and the young people. And another thing that also pushed us to this, we work around a right-based approach, and even more specifically, a gender transformative approach. And we understand from our end that we are not able to get to a gender transformative approach if we do not change the norms and the rule and the different things and social conditioning that you really have around gender. So we'll not be able to get to a pleasure-based concept if we are not able to also look at it from a gender transformative approach. If we are not able to look at it at the different ways we have been socialized to think and believe about pleasure and sexuality. And that's not to say that pleasure is not something that people do not speak about in Kenya, because I know with my friends, amongst our group friends, and amongst people from the same peer group, you'll hear people speak about it, but in very harsh tones and in situations where no one else would hear, not close to where the parents are or close where to people who are considered respectable are. And this is something we want to change. It's a very good thing. Why are we hiding? We are trying to bring it more in spaces where people can freely speak about pleasure, really learn from one another, and people, when we this, will be able to break barriers and also break some sexual injustices that have been happening around us. So I think that would briefly be what I am doing currently in Kenya and what I hope.
I will just unmute. Thank you so much, Judy. And I can also make available some of the other material that Judy shared with me. And like I said, I found it super relatable. Like I was reading a part of the report where it said that older learners who were interacting with the sexual ed facilitators or the sexual educators had sometimes knew stuff that the educators didn't know. So then they asked like some complex question or like out of syllabus question. And then the educator was like, get out of my class. I mean, it was politely phrased, but that was essentially what it was. And I was like, oh, I really relate to this. It's feeling very, very close to home, right? So there's a lot of like anecdotal detail written in very sober text in this paper, and it's really worth reading if this is your area. So Surabhi, I wanted to ask you, I know you're coming at the pleasure aspect in two ways in your life. I mean, you have two projects going on, both of which speak to the idea of pleasure. Could you talk us through it and how both of them happen?
Yeah, I have to admit that listening to Anne and Judy, I actually forgot how I had planned to start. I was just listening and taking notes. Yeah, this is an important point for my student. I need to remember this while designing the curriculum at Saje. Yeah, there are two projects that I run. One is Women at Leisure, which puts leisure at the heart of seeing the world. I use a lot of different lenses when it comes to gender. One is just defining leisure, what leisure means, how is it different and same as pleasure. Then I use different lenses, different intersectionality to discuss it. You bring it gender in it, you bring caste in it, you bring class in it, you bring geography in it, and see how leisure changes. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a bit. The second one is Saji Sapne, which is a much bolder and bigger project where we're working with young women in villages and supporting them as they launch their careers. And when I say careers, I'm talking about a growth path. So it's not just a livelihood or a job, but there has to be growth in their income, in their salaries, in their skills, in their titles. So these two are my areas of work. All I do is at the intersection of gender and rural development. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is from the context of gender, rural, and caste and class. Women at Leisure had begun. It essentially is exploring time as a feminist issue, right? Like when we discuss resources, we are discussing property, money, rights. We don't discuss time as a resource. And I think that's what Leisure is Women at Leisure or Project Basanti is trying to do. It's trying to understand and see when women and girls spend time for themselves. So that's how we define leisure. It could be by resting, it could be by pleasurable activities, it could be by longing, it could be by being sad, it could be anything, but spending time for yourself. It could be with someone, it could be by yourself. So the way when Nisha and I were discussing this panel earlier, the way I was trying to distinguish between pleasure and leisure. Can you hear me? I think I lost you. My goodness.
You're
Hello?
fine. You're good to go, Surabhi.
Okay. For a moment, I thought I lost everyone. Okay. Let me know if I need to turn off my video. Okay. Yeah, and I think when you talk about pleasure, there is a spectrum of emotion or the words that come to mind. And the way I was trying to define it is, what is the word for pleasure in Hindi, right? And we can think about sukoon, you can think about khushi. Sukoon is contentment, peace, khushi is happiness. Then there is manoranjan, entertainment. Then there is maza, that is fun. Then there is dil khol ke khush ho jana, ecstasy, right? And pleasure revolves somewhere in the spectrum. And then I was thinking about how would I define leisure? Like what emotions or what spectrum of emotion am I going to talk about when I'm talking about leisure? And I think leisure has a bit more broader expanse. I can be deeply sad and still be at leisure. I can be deeply lost and still be at leisure, right? And I think we do not think about pleasure or leisure in that sense when we think about women, especially women in villages, because I think especially mainstream media, what it has done is it has created this monolithic image of women in villages. Either they are extremely in pain, they deserve our pity, they're subjects of our they're objects of our pity, that oh my god, they don't have enough, oh my god, they don't know enough. Or even if you look at the news, the headlines are mostly around what bad has happened to women in India in villages. Or they are this highly romanticized version given by Bollywood. They're very innocent, they don't know the world, and they are here to just listen to you and just shower your love. No, I mean, they are as complex as all of us. They have very complex identities. They have a lot of interesting ideas. They have a vibrant imagination. And we are losing all of that because we don't see them as people. We don't see, until they are headlines for one or the other reasons, we don't want to see them in their complexity. So women at leisure, if I can pull up some images, that'll be nice. That gives a visual. I think the whole repository it's a repository of photos and videos of women just taking out time for themselves, right? And it looks pretty colorful. What it does is the moment you take leisure as a lens, all of a sudden you start thinking about labor. All of a sudden you start thinking about who can afford it and what can it look like. For example, this photograph, it's actually of my family, my brother and my sister-in-law. It's in a familial setting. He has put up the hairbands of his daughter because he wanted to put this face mask, and the face mask that she usually puts on, and he wanted to try it. And it's a very ordinary moment, to be very honest. Can we go to a different slide? Next slide. This photograph was one of the most liked photograph when I had put it up on Instagram. And what people don't know is the backstories of why women want to spend time in nature, or what that time means. We don't imagine women in the woods unharmed, especially in the context of India. We advise our girls and women not to go in the woods by themselves, especially. It's not safe, it's not good for them, it's not reputable in a lot of places. And there are a bunch of photographs that I have taken of women in nature, and I usually sit down and talk to them about the time that they spend. In Hindi, you call leisure fursat. फुर्सत में क्यों आपको कहीं पे जहाँ पे कोई भी जंगल का एरिया हो या कोई भी प्राकृतिक एरिया हो, वहाँ क्यों जाने का मन है? Why do you feel like spending time by yourself in nature? And women in villages do that a lot, right? It can be farming, it can be herding cattle, it can be because you were going for your personal affairs in the fields. And there are very interesting stories that come out of it. Someone told me that her house is not safe for her, and that's why she likes spending time in the woods by herself, especially by herself. She was harassed by someone in her own family, and that's why she likes spending time in the nature. And that's what leisure to her mean. To her, leisure is an escape from her physical reality, not just her emotional reality, from her physical reality. Can we go on to next photograph? I think leisure is very contextual, pleasure is very contextual, right? For example, since there was a lot of conversation around sex education before me, a lot of times women in villages are not seen as active sexual beings enjoying sex, right? They are, one, because of the headlines. A lot of times it's mostly rape victims, right? Or rape survivors or harassment survivors. And then there is this idea of that if in urban India, sex and shame go hand in hand, then in villages the situation must be worse. But actually, in my experience of working with both living in villages and also working in villages, I have roots in a village in Bundelkhand. Women in villages are pretty solid in there when it comes to raunchy talk, and they are very good at it. And I think I was completely agreeing with Judy and Anne when they were talking about when you put pleasure at the heart of understanding this space, you're going to open so much more. When we talk about sex education in villages, or birth planning in villages, or reproductive and sexual health topics in villages, you make it very instructional rather than a dialogue where there is a woman who has a sexual life and you discuss with her why she's doing what she's doing and what part of it she enjoys. A good way of knowing what can make an amazing curriculum for sex ed in villages is actually sit through marriage ceremonies, weddings. That's when women get in one room, and the amount of raunchy talk or the dirty talk that happens in a room is phenomenal. And understanding the idea of kink or BDSM in that context. The words might be different, the language might be different, the metaphors used might be very different, but hey, everyone is enjoying receiving it and giving it. But again, I'm just using pleasure as a part of the whole, just in the context of sex, but there's a lot more when it comes to pleasure. I'm going to just wrap it up by introducing Sajhe a bit more. That Sajhe began with the idea that young women in villages have a lot of dreams, or can have a lot of dreams like a lot of us, and we are not doing justice to their dreams. We don't think about careers for them, we don't think about growth for them, and I think we wanted to shift that narrative of talking about women in villages in terms of pain to potential. What is Yeah, that's all about my work. And I think, Nisha, I'm going to leave it to you and your questions.
Thank you, Surabhi. So I could see Judy shaking her head vigorously through many things that you were saying, and I wanted to just check back in with her. So Judy, I know when we spoke as well, you were saying this thing that sometimes the words are different. Sometimes you have to ask educators very specifically, like, how do you talk about pleasure? And then the context in which these things are discussed, it plays out differently. It may not be in the comprehensive sexuality education ways, but other kinds of conversations of pleasure could happen, is what something that you were saying, right?
Yeah, and I was agreeing very heavily with Yadav because I also relate with the same kind of setup. As we were speaking earlier, Nisha, I had shared that most things about pleasure and sexuality in our context are shared with by older women to younger women. But the only disconnect there is that it's not just any woman, it's a woman who is getting married maybe the next day, or a woman who is almost getting married. And the talk that goes on there, and there are women actually who are also would think maybe because they are from the rural areas, or there are women who are marginalized, we sometimes think they do not have this kind of information. But the talk that goes on there is truly raunchy and it's truly phenomenal. The only thing that I would wish for is that would actually take these conversations from such hidden places, places where we do not know this kind of, or these women have this kind of information, but now bring it to a place where it's more accessible to young women who are actually also having sex and also want to experience pleasure, not only for the sake of getting married, but just for the sake of their health and also their feeling nice, their own well-being. And the fact that also there's also a disconnect between generations. We see older women who have this information and carries this information. They even know how to defend themselves in certain spaces when need be. But there's a disconnect where younger women now, because they are not speaking about it in that context, younger women now are not getting married as early as what would have been considered in the past. So therefore, this information is not there, and people are not talking about it as much as we would have wished that they would speak about it. So also looking at how we can bridge the gap and bringing together this kind of information and this kind of sessions that we can have them and get this kind of information and speak about it and laugh about it and enjoy it, because it's also part of enjoying. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about a sort of a data type question. Okay, based on work that, like the work that Judy has done in research and other research that has happened around the world, and the Pleasure Project is currently doing like a massive literature review, right? And I wish you tell us a little bit about it and why it's so important and why you're like at it with screws and spanners to make it to make it perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. But just first to completely agree with Judy and Surabhi about the lack of honouring of that knowledge. I think that, you know, the fact that that knowledge is something that is there in communities, in conversations, and that we need to bring that into the more, I don't know, mainstream evidence, really, in terms of how people can talk about pleasure. And in terms of the public health and HIV and sort of mainstream evidence, we've been working for a long time to convince that world that pleasure inclusive sexual health is not only, you know, the way to go forward, but it's also more effective. It actually means that people use condoms more. They actually, you know, there's less STIs. And sadly, this has been an area that has been little studied. There's been a couple of kind of major systematic reviews, they've called, that go through the evidence. There was one in 2004, and we did a literature review in 2006, which is on our website. It's called Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Pleasure, Health and Sex, but Were Too Scared to Ask. So you can just download that from our website. But we've wanted to update that because this is what's going to convince the people who have the power to change sex education, right? To get stuff published in the peer-reviewed journals and so on, and to really come up with, as you say, the the highest quality standard of evidence, which is a systematic review with the hammers and the nails and the screws, and making sure the whole thing is reaching those acceptable standards. And so we're doing it with World Health Organization and an organization called The Case for Her. And we just got news yesterday that we think it will be published in a couple of months, which is exciting. And basically we looked through every single sexual and reproductive health study for the last 15 years. And then we pulled out of some 13,000 studies. It had to be experimental trials that compared a usual intervention with another one. And we pulled out just 33 that had some pleasure in them. And then we looked across those 33 to say, what difference does that make in terms of health outcomes and sexual health outcomes? And you'll have to wait and see for when the article comes out. We're bound to silence until the article comes out. But, you know, it will be helpful in terms of not only convincing people who can make a difference in terms of sexual health funding and policy. And I think one thing we talked about, Nisha, that before what I found really interesting was that there's a real sort of different standards from some work that's absolutely starts from a positive perspective, that's empowering, that recognizes people's lived experiences, like the way Judy was talking about before, to others that are kind of sex negative interventions with a little bit of eroticizing condom use. So, and actually when I read some of the studies, I mean, I would just felt exhausted and sad just reading the studies, because some that we found, you know, it would be like, we worked with high risk groups who had unprotected anal sex, and we sat them down and we said to them, why aren't you using a condom? I mean, these are the ones we didn't include. And you're like, God, well, what are you going to say if somebody sits you down and starts asking you those questions, as opposed to saying, when would you use a condom? Or when's it been good when you used a condom? Or when did sex feel good? So it was rather an epic undertaking through the 13,000 articles.
I know, you know, you can't have any spoilers, but here's to hoping for a happy ending for your study. So actually,
just
I wanted to connect what you just said to something that Surabhi has been talking about, and actually in our conversations, even Judy has been talking about this. Yes, the idea that pleasure is like an additional burden. I mean, that's where the panel name came from, right? The idea that funding agencies and people in charge often go to this thing that, oh, we can't ask marginalized communities to now also like take on the burden of pleasure, right? Like, why would you make them do this, right? So when, yes, that is like a terrifying approach. But I found it interesting when I was talking to Surabhi that she looked at her Instagram archive as a place of data as well. Like what are the ways in which we can understand pleasure and leisure, and how might you complicate this? And she used the magic word. She used intersectionality, and I'm dying to hear it all over again. So, would you talk a little bit about why you think all leisure is not pleasure, or all pleasure is not pleasure?
Yeah. And also how it is very contextual. I was just thinking, when I was starting in the social sector, when I was starting my career as a very idealistic 22-year-old, I remember asking this question, that why policymakers or why development practitioners keep wanting to open toilets in villages. Why don't they think about opening beauty parlors? And I can have my own personal view on what beauty is and how beauty can be defined and all of that. But to be very honest, women in villages in a lot of places are not asking for toilets. What they might be asking, like in my village, for example, and again, this is very anecdotal and not necessarily to be extrapolated everywhere. In my village, it's a very precious space. There is no beauty parlor in my village, the place that I come from, Budilkhand. And there is no beauty parlor. There are 1 or 2 girls who have learned how to apply some makeup, and they become famous during the wedding ceremonies, right? And they are the ones who are called in every place. But that's the space where intimate conversations just flow. So if you were to introduce any government scheme for women, or if you were to introduce an intervention in a community through women, how about you just, go to safe spaces that are already created, or create new safe spaces, right? Anyway, that was more touching upon the point that Anne and Judy were talking about. When we start seeing the positive or the pleasure at the center of designing things. How pleasure and leisure look different, and how they look different for different context, and what does it do when you start collecting this visual data? One, it creates visuals. For example, when you create a visual, it does two things. You start noticing that this exists, and you start noticing, why didn't I notice it yet? So, for example, Women at Leisure, it had began as a very personal project which was sort of a guilt project. My mother passed away, and I got to know a lot about her life after her death. And I just realized I never knew her as a person. I knew her as my mother, but I didn't know what she was like as a person. What was her worldview? What was her idea of fun or relaxing, right? And when I started talking to her friends, and that's what started surfacing, that she was like this fun, entertaining woman, not the image that I had of my mother. My mother was pretty strict with the children, with us actually. Managing 4 children is like herding cats. No, and so a lot of conversations in the DM in Women at Leisure happens. A lot of men actually reach out and they talk about, oh, I didn't even notice that my partner doesn't rest enough. And because Women at Leisure is a very ordinary project. Like in an ideal world, it shouldn't get the recognition it gets right now. Because I literally click, I'm not a photographer. I have never worked on my art of photography or craft of photography. And the photographs are very ordinary. Like one of the photographs that got recently famous was a woman sitting on her sofa and reading a paper, a newspaper. Why is it a big deal? It shouldn't be a big deal. She is an active participant of this democracy. She should be reading a newspaper. But imagining a woman who is not wearing a suit, she's not an executive. She is actually a middle class homemaker, mother, probably mother of 2 children. And she's this newspaper open and she's reading. But it looks so radical to all of us, to most of us, that, oh, I have never imagined my mother actually taking interest in news. Because it's easier for me to imagine my father sitting outside the house right in the morning and reading the newspaper than to imagine a woman right in the morning reading a newspaper. Why is it a radical act? It shouldn't be a radical act, right? And when these simple things start becoming or start looking like a radical act, that means all of us are oppressed in one or the other way, right? And so I think, yeah, one, it does what is the impact of creating such a data or creating such a visual, that a lot of people who were not necessarily readily engaging in the conversation of labor or engaging in the conversation on unequal distribution of resources, all of a sudden it becomes a welcome and a warm, non-intimidating invitation to them that, hey, if her resting seems very radical to you, think about what we're doing to her time and to her resources, right? So it creates visuals and it creates an imagination of what is missing, right? Second, as I was saying, it's a lot more complicated than just joy and entertainment. Taking time out for yourself, it essentially defines who you are. What do you do when nobody is watching? Or what do you do when your guards are down? And guards are of many kinds. It could be a capitalistic guard, right? Like, I have to be productive today. I cannot afford to be unproductive, right? So that's a guard up. It could be a guard of relationships. I have to be on my best behavior as a daughter-in-law. I have to be on my best behavior as a son of this house, right? So that's another, it's a guard of gender. Then there is caste, right? That there is a certain perception that a lot of communities have about people in different caste. Am I supposed, for example, the place that I was born and brought up in Madhya Pradesh, there are a lot of indigenous communities that live there, and we call them Adivasis, and there are such beautiful, interesting traditions and rituals that they have which are centered on pleasure. Like a lot of fairs where young people come together, get slightly drunk, enjoy courting each other. They actually are choosing who could be the next partner for them, right? And it happens out in open, right? And because casteism exists, those pleasurable activities all of a sudden in other caste groups are considered not respectable, not reputable. But actually there's so much to learn from that progressive space, whatever that they've created, right? So then caste comes in picture, that how do I spend my time and how would it be judged depends on the caste and the community that I was brought up in, depends on the resources that I received by being part of that caste community, right? Then of course geography plays a big role. Am I in city, am I in village? On Instagram, self-love movement or hashtag self-love is a very mainstream hashtag, but the image that comes to our mind is of a person maybe in a spa or maybe, partying with her friends. It's an easy image to conjure up, right? But how about me sitting under a tree with a bunch of my friends under the pretext of religious activity? And religion actually plays a big role in creating spaces of pleasure and leisure. And we should discuss more about that what are the nuances of creating these religious spaces which actually are at the expense of women's equality or their rights. But at the end of the day, it's also creating a space where they can just be themselves. And you can't let go of that nuance, right? So yeah, whenever I try to document leisure, I try to see these couple of lenses. It's also about class, what resources do you have? Who can actually afford spending time for herself? If I'm a mother who has to manage my house, manage the work that I have to do outside to earn the living, and also I have to take care of the farm, what does my leisure looks like if I cannot afford to take rest? So yeah, I think we really don't have an idea. I think the reason why Women at Leisure gets the support or the recognition it gets because we are not collecting this kind of data. We don't know what women do to relax. We don't know what women of particular caste and class do to just take rest or to spend time for themselves. And if they were spending time for themselves, what kind of creations will come out of them? What kind of poems will come out of them? What kind of art that will come out of them? So did I answer your question, Nisha? That's
yes, yes, I did. I mean, beautifully, actually.
Okay.
So what I enjoyed in our pre-conversations is also this sense of while pleasure is like joy, the ways in which can happen or not happen is complicated. So the idea that that keynote address, Louisa Allen's keynote address is also about this, how it cannot be prescriptive and, in some sense, operationalized. Now we will just deliver pleasure along with our HIV, communications in little whatever, or mosquito nets or whatever else that people have got going in their Excel sheets. So it's interesting that what it can be then is also sort of a chaotic, like an agent of chaos in some sense, right? It doesn't allow you an easy yes, no answer for consent. It doesn't make anything easy. So if you want to be like, I'm all modern and religion is not part of my life, so I reject this, but or if you take the other position, as you were saying, and saying, oh, religion is great, like all these ladies hanging out in the satsang are having such a jolly time, and then you miss what else is going on in the satsang, then you miss that. So I mean, I really like that lens. And I think in one conversation Anne and I were having, she was describing this really hilarious, actually I think around a conference, a situation where people were getting very worked up around, is this person having consensual sex or not, or do we need to bring a therapist in? And this is like basically going bananas. And then do you want to talk about that anecdote? Because I know I laughed for like a solid 10 minutes afterwards.
Okay, I'll try and remember, but yeah, just to say I completely agree also with what the Women at Leisure stuff is amazing, Surabhi, and it's something I've heard, the things that you said, Nisha, like often basically the only negative thing I've heard about our pleasure activism has been from feminists in the north of the globe who've said, oh, women don't have time for this in Africa, like poor women don't have time for this. And I'm like, well, did you ask them? And also, are you gatekeeping that time, or it doesn't cost to masturbate? Like, what's the barrier here, right? So I think there's also long historical narratives around how international development and how health should be done. which are very pleasure denying and which are very agency denying. So yeah, I think, you know, and looking across those is really interesting. You know, sex education in the UK in the past used to be more pleasure based. Who knew that before Victorian times, right? So I think we also need to look at, like you say, these still, thankfully, these communities' knowledge around pleasure. But sorry, I'm not answering your question. I'm just getting excited by everything that's being.
No way, that's fine. And let's be agents of chaos here as well. It's fine. But
so basically,
yeah, the question, I'm trying to remember a little more keywords from our very long conversation. But I think it was very in parallel to something that Surabhi was also saying, that, you know, there is a kind of political correctness that creeps in both in social media and also in the development sector, which says they want to embrace pleasure as a principle, but is still in that old mode and is like sort of struggling.
I think the example was I'm in an advisory group for a randomized control trial, which is comparing pleasure inclusive sexual health to non in the UK for STI, for sexually transmitted infections, whether it will reduce them, which is really exciting. There was a conversation happening about if a young person mentions that they've had sex that they didn't want, then all the buttons would be pressed and the alerts would go and they would get contacted and it would be a safeguarding issue. And then we're having a conversation about it. And I was like, well, do they know that's what's going to happen? Because that's going to be an external expert. And, you know, you need to line people up for that. And then somebody on the advisory group who's amazing said, but wait a minute, there's a difference between forced sex and, you know, abusive sex and sex you maybe didn't want at that, you know, or sex that, you know, isn't totally pleasurable. You've maybe decided to have it because you know, want your husband to put the bins out and it puts him in a good mood or something like that, you know. So like that line kind of between sex, which definitely was, you know, forced, or sex you didn't want, or maybe, or I'm using the wrong words there. I mean, basically it was a conversation about the lines between, it's not as binary as we might like to think in terms of the different contexts and motivations at that moment in terms of how we're choosing to have sex, and actually having some conversations about that around agency and about consent so that people are really able to choose and really able to have informed consent is really, really important. And pleasure needs to be at the heart of that, because how can people choose what they want and choose the pleasure or the leisure that they want if they're never able to understand that, right? If they're only told to say no. And that's so common in sex education that, you know, and in many of the studies we read actually for the WHO work, there was a lot of empowerment interventions for young women, and they said, we're going to empower young women, and then it was all, we're going to teach them to say no. And there was someone that were teaching them hand gestures also, say no, say no. And I was like, well, when's they say yes? Like, say no, but then say no to what? Like, so it was just like
make all the K-drama heart symbols.
I'm loving your interpretation, by the way. I've learned how to interpret masturbate, so that's great.
Can you do it, Anne?
I think it was quite male-centric, right? Show us again.
Show us again. Show it to us now.
Not to put you on the spot, you don't have to.
So I have like a biggish question for all of you, and then, you know, we could take questions from the audience if that's okay. So, you know, in case you hadn't noticed, we are in the middle of a massive global health communications crisis also, as well as everything else. Okay. So here's a chance to just like think aloud about if you were in charge of this massive global crisis, and how to communicate all the different health issues that we have right now. How would you work it out using a pleasure lens? You know, just after having said, let's not operationalize pleasure, I'm saying let's operationalize pleasure right away. So.
Well, so shall I jump in? I personally think the pleasure principles are a way of operationalizing pleasure, right? But in a fun, inspirational, practical way. So the problem with operationalizing is often that it becomes the massive Excel spreadsheet that makes you feel completely daunted, right? So our pleasure principles are actually about the joy you can have on the journey to pleasure inclusion. But in terms of the pandemic, I mean, there has been some
masks and vaccines and, you know, the works basically. So
yeah, I mean, I think we learn a lot from AIDS was the first epidemic I worked on, right, and pandemic. And I think there's been a lot of learning about what went wrong with that, and actually how, you know, you use communities' knowledge to be able to communicate risk. And I think, you know, in terms of practical examples, there has been some interesting stuff where people have sexied up masks, you know, and I personally, you know, it's quite a relief sometimes to wear a mask because you then can like sort of, you know, look a bit different or look a bit mysterious, or and there's been some good examples of actually a very few, but some advice for sex during the pandemic that is actually really practical and sexy. So how to play with yourself, which is obviously a really important intervention during periods of lockdown, how to communicate with your partner from a distance, you know, how to manage when you're not able to see all of your sexual partners, a whole raft of stuff that's really quite exciting and innovative. And I think, and some governments put out advice. So Colombia, Brazil, the New York City health department, that was actually really practical. And I think they panicked a bit, to be honest. And so it forced them to be able to actually look through a pleasure lens. Agents of Ishq has done some great stuff. So I think also I went to a really fascinating meeting about the future of sex, and there was a woman who does virtual sex sort of software, and she said they've had a massive boost. So I think, you know, anyway, people were on this cusp, and don't they say that, I know in the UK millennials are supposedly having less sex, as in meeting each other to have sex, but they're having lots of remote sex. So there was already a lot of expertise out there in young people that the rest of the world can learn from in terms of more creative ways to have sex.
How to do it on World of Warcraft. So, Judy, Surabhi, thoughts?
Yeah, I think, and I'm gonna, what you had mentioned in the email, just think out loud. I feel a lot of interventions or a lot of announcements during COVID, particularly in India, were made on an ignorant understanding that home is a safe space. Okay, Nisha, did you lose me? Oops. Oh, okay, you can hear me. God, it seems that I get frozen and that I can't see anyone. Okay. Yeah, so I think that the ignorant assumption or the ignorant basis of forming a lot of reaction to what to do during COVID was assuming that the home is safe space, and two, that everyone has a home. And I think both of those were really oversight. I would say it was a cruel oversight in a sense that, because there is enough data about it, homes are not safe, not just in India, anywhere in this world. Right? Like a lot of most people, most women who get harassed and who get sexually assaulted, they happen by the perpetrators are usually people that you know, and usually they are from families or relatives, right? So when you think in terms of leisure, or when you think in terms of pleasure, thinking in terms of where do women get that? Is it the home that's where they're getting usually, or there is some other safe space? And if it is home, what conditions make it a safe space? Is it when the children and the husband is out, or is it when other family members are out? So just thinking in terms of safety, not just the safety from the disease, but safety from each other, actually. To me, if someone was actually very proactively listening to data and designing for the data that already exists around women's safety, especially, or children's safety, I think there should have been more proactive attempt of creating safe spaces, because home is necessarily not a safe space for a lot of people. I mean, people from trans community, people from LGBT community, you're all of a sudden packed living with your family who might not be very supportive of your sexuality or your identity. The other thing was also that a lot of conversation around mental health was revolving around how to calm the anxiety, you know, or how to, but I think when you think about pleasure and leisure both, think in terms of how do you view this world when you're going through a loss? How do you experience this world when you're going through a tragedy? And we were going through massive despair. And during second wave in COVID, I mean, it was horrendous. And it was on every single day basis, it would feel that, oh my God, X number of people have died in your own social circle. There are, you know, oxygen cylinders are missing, it's hard to get beds in the hospitals. We all find a way to spend time with ourselves. So what does leisure and loss looks like? and this is, I'm talking more in terms of mental health practitioners. If we had a bit more nuanced understanding of pleasure and leisure, how do people like to spend time for yourself when you're going through a loss? It could be a personal loss, and it could simply mean you processing it. It could simply mean you sitting with the grief. It could simply mean, rather than getting over it or dealing with it head on, so I don't know. I think there was not a lot of conversation on pleasure or leisure when we were talking about mental health. But as Anne and Judy have emphasized again and again, how about you pick this up as a lens and ask the right questions, and people will figure it out for themselves. Like, nobody is asking you to ignore the pain. We're just asking you to choose a different driver. Use pleasure or leisure, or in Saj's case, potential as the driver. Let that be the driver. Let that be the lens with which you see your world and understand your world. And then everything is going to come out of it, right? Like, you're going to see pain and you're going to respond to it. You're going to see grief, you're going to respond to it. So yeah, I think these are the two things that came to my mind when you were talking about the pandemic and pleasure,
No, that was very useful. Judy, what did you have in mind when you were thinking about this?
Yeah, so for me, I think we saw a lot of, I'll speak about this in the sex education context. During COVID, we did see a lot of education move from being in school to doing it at home through Zoom calls, and others doing it in different spaces and different areas. But we can see already what was missing. The fact that already sex education is not that common in very many households, many schools, and even all over the world. I think in some of the regions in this world, sex education is not very common and not very in curriculums in that context. So this would be a time that would be it would be very useful to have champions of pleasure and sexuality education. And that would be possible through having teachers who look at pleasure and sexuality in a positive lens, who are willing to actually speak to young people and adolescents about sex, and also not in that context of just trying to not to catch a disease or trying not to get pregnant or that. That's something that also came up during the research, that we do have very few people who are champions of pleasure. You can imagine if we had more people at that time who are champions of pleasure, providing this information through the very many social media platforms that were available at that time. Apart from making banana breads, would also be able to get more information about pleasure. That would have been a good thing to do. And then I didn't make a banana
fully
bread.
agreed on the banana bread comment. You have my full support.
Yeah, and I think secondly, this has really taught us to look, to step outside the box and not just look at pleasure and sexuality education as such a textbook thing, as I had mentioned earlier. But also imagine if you had more digital content on pleasure. Imagine how that would have actually really reached so many people and impacted so many people. We have so many people who are together in the house. People who did not even know how much more to do. There are so many jokes and memes about how sex was and dating was during the pandemic. Having this kind of content would have really taken advantage of that situation and being able to create spaces where we can have this kind of conversation in a very positive way and not in a way that is discriminatory in any way.
We have questions. So with your permission, I'm going to start taking some of these questions. Is that okay? Okay, so one is a general comment. Vinita from YP says, not a question, just want to say that all of your work sounds so interesting. Surabhi, Judy and Anne, thanks for sharing it with us. Also, Logna Base Barwa says, Surabhi, I really enjoyed your sharing. Looking forward to exploring more of your work. Guys, none of you want to ask questions. You just want to say yay, yay. Okay. Okay, so Sushmita also says, this isn't a question. Thank you so much, Surabhi, Anne and Nisha, and Indian Sign Language champs, seriously champs for this conversation. I snuck away from work to attend. It was totally worth it. We agree. Nayantara says, Surabhi, love everything you share. Thanks for doing what you do. Okay. And now, do we have any actual questions, guys? Yes. Oh, we do. Oh, lovely, lovely.
Oh,
Okay, we do have
are
actual
you
questions.
stopping the compliments?
No,
Keep
no,
the compliments
no, no.
coming.
We'll keep it like sandwich. Little bit
Fine.
compliment, some question, then one little bit compliment.
Fine.
This is my pleasure principle, guys.
It's exactly in keeping with the pleasure theme. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so Janvi's asked a question. Surabhi, how much would a woman's leisure time would be a function of her control over her own time? How much would leisure be a function
Yeah.
of control over her own time, as a question?
Well, the generic answer is depends on the context, right? But a little more deeper answer is just like any other resource. In fact, time is the most scarce resource I feel a lot of women have, given the amount of responsibilities that are given and also a lot of responsibilities that are taken for granted. Because men get to rest because their responsibilities are seen as responsibilities, that he has just come back from work and that's why he needs to relax, and that's why he cannot engage in childcare right now because he's tired. But it's just assumed that a woman, even if she was working in a farm or she was working in an office, it's just assumed. So like a lot of resources, the ownership depends on what kind of power dynamic that you have with the setting around you. I have to admit though, it's not a very yes and no answer connected to financial independence. We often assume, it's also a very reasonable assumption that if women have more money, they will have more agency to say yes and no to what they can engage in and what they don't engage in. But I think the societal expectation of caregiving still cuts across different caste and across different class, is very much disproportionately with women. So that even when you have more money, so that means you can afford more time for yourself, even then, in my understanding, I don't have a concrete data for this. So in my understanding, financial independence necessarily is not the answer for having more ownership on time. And the way I see it in two different, just if I using geography as a lens, like urban and rural, in urban, the guards that bind you a lot are very capitalistic guards, that I have to be productive. If I'm earning a lot, that means I'm working a lot. So that's the guard that keeps you, that snatches your time. In rural, and again, these are broad generalizations, people. If you're listening to this, don't take them as key takeaways, but yeah, like just asterisk mark. There is an asterisk mark to it. That context, everything is context based, right? But in the rural setting, the guards that take your time away are more societal. That you're expected to, you're also being productive, but in a different setting, right? But I feel because there are more community spaces and community practices within villages, a lot more than that in the cities, I do feel sometimes women end up spending a lot more quality time with themselves. Because there are spaces. For example, just the village that I am in right now, we went for a community lunch yesterday, and that was for Barsi, year after someone in your family died, and you organize a community lunch for them, right? And it was such a beautiful space, in a sense that there were a lot of women who came and who sat with the person who was bereaving, and they just sat. And that is leisure and loss. In my understanding, that is how I define it, that everyone is just sitting, and it is an societally approved leisure activity. So yeah, since societal guards are more controlling here, but there are also a lot more community spaces. I did not give you a very direct answer, Janvi. The answer is just like any other resources. It is very context driven, and the power dynamic around your own setting. How much negotiation power do you have with yourself, with your immediate people, and with the society at large? That's how leisure. And will all leisure will be pleasurable? That depends again on how much agency I have on resources.
I've got a clear takeaway from this meeting. I'm writing it down, which is when my children come back from school, I'm going to ask them, how does their mum have fun? Poor things. They're going to get a grilling now.
You must ask them. That's how Women at Leisure started. I was like, I just don't know what my mother enjoyed. Like, I had no idea. And once I started noticing and reflecting, I was like, oh my God, she did have something.
Before
But
their
yeah,
bag is on the
please do that to
floor,
them.
I'm going to pop straight out there and
Yes.
ask them, how do I have fun? Poor things. They're going to be like intimidated.
By teasing poor kids like us. That's how mother has fun. But yes, please ask them that question.
Meta. Oh, whoa, Surabhi, you're taking my mind away.
I'm going to follow up with you on email about this. I'm really curious. What do they answer?
Judy, there's a tough question. Okay, the question is, how do you deal with social or religious backlash where you work?
Okay, I was expecting this question. First of all, we already get backlash by different groups, religious groups, conservative groups, groups who call themselves conservative, such as conservative parents. And that backlash we get it even before we speak about pleasure. So for such a long time, we've already been getting backlash because of advocating for comprehensive sexuality education in schools and advocating for access to reproductive health services, advocating for the rights of people who identify with different gender identities and sexual orientation. So the fact that we also get backlash around pleasure is not new. And we've also figured out ways how to also counter opposition and also maneuver our way around opposition. One of the ways that has really worked very well for us is not giving a lot of attention to the backlash that is coming in, because there's always going to be backlash. Instead, we focus on providing the correct information. Instead, we focus on, the kind of panic we get or people get when they've actually just been attacked by opposition. So we are that particular kind of attitude throughout. So every time we think, if we are actually attacked by an opposition right now, what will we do? So what we would have actually done, we do it now. So having this conversation openly and also forming relationships or having relationships with the religious leaders in different spaces and in different areas in the country has also helped to back us up in our engagement.
So, and there's a question, do you think talking about pleasure can help you talk about consent?
Definitely. Because, starting from having a conversation about what's been the best sex you've had, or what kind of sexual relationship would you like to have, what kind of intimate relationship you'd like to have, then leads you into, from a positive perspective, what people want, and then them understanding that. I mean, I don't think those are questions that many of us ask ourselves, right? And they're important questions to ask ourselves, and it requires some kind of self-reflection about your previous both negative and positive experiences. That then gives you the possibility to ask for what you want or know what you don't want. But at the moment, the conversation's so one-sided. And as I said, like in that intervention where young women were taught only to say no, then how do they know what they want to say yes to if they're only taught to say no, right? So absolutely, it's absolutely core and central to conversations around consent. But sadly,
That's the biggest takeaway. I have noted it down for my students. Like, if they don't know what to say yes to, how are they going to know what to say no to? And so thank you for that, Anne.
So we unfortunately, we have a bunch of questions which have just popped up, but we only have a minute to wrap up. So I'm going to encourage anyone whose question hasn't been answered to follow Anne, Judy, and Surabhi on social media and just, check in with them. They're really great with responding and giving like solid answers, which you can put on a t-shirt. Okay, so I encourage you to do it because I can see some really great questions, but we don't have the time for it right now. Instead, I'm going to do something super frivolous, okay, which is great. Taruni says, this is a great conversation. I've been smiling through most of it, just hearing about the work. My question is slightly more frivolous. I would really love to see the poster behind Anne and hear a bit about it.
Okay, so I did tell you before, I put this poster up to hide some of the mess, but it's basically a pleasure project poster. And this is my friend, Sen, our friend, and she's having a look at herself in the mirror and smiling with great pleasure and enjoying the view of herself. And she's at leisure.
I was just thinking that Anne and I definitely need to collaborate. Pleasure and pleasure. Gonna send an email.
I want to do a campaign about women at pleasure and leisure.
Oh.
Sounds good. So I'm encouraging everyone to send your questions to the social media platforms, to the Pleasure Project, to Women at Leisure, to Judy's website, all of these places, and ask your questions. They are great questions, but we don't have a lot of time. So thank you everyone for attending, all 112 of you. Okay. And thank you, Anne, thank you, Judy, thank you, Surabhi, and thank you everyone at the conference.